Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or the Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my top 5 wide receiver targets to be trading for in Dynasty Fantasy Football before the 2021 NFL Draft. Now, before I get into it, I want to actually know down below who your guys' trade targets are that you guys are looking for if you play in Dynasty Fantasy Football for 2021. Maybe you're ending up going to be typing some guys that I talk about, or maybe you're looking completely different than me. I'd love to have a nice chat down below in the comment section. And while you're down there, if you are new, please make sure to hit that subscribe button down there. Not only is it free, I put out content every single day talking about fantasy football, I talk about Dynasty sometimes, talking about the NFL Draft, as well as the NFL as a whole. So if you like football, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're going to have a great time every single day talking about football. So let's get into it. My first trade target for Dynasty right now is Robert Woods, currently coming off the board based on ADP as wide receiver 26. Now, I'm not too sure how much you want to bake in a guy's ADP when you're looking to trade for him in Dynasty leagues, but it tells you that he's not necessarily up there in favor with a majority of fantasy players if he's wide receiver 26, when in my opinion he could easily be a top 12 wide receiver, which is why I am telling you to trade for him. Now, I am coming from the point of view that Dynasty is like a 3-year window you're looking at, right? I think it's impossible to project where Robert Woods will be 5 years from now. It really is. It really is. He could be out of the league. The guy is 29 years old right now. He could easily play for 5 years, but he could easily hang it up as well. So I'm just going to be projecting like 3 years into the future. And I think that's what most of you guys should do who are playing Dynasty. Understand that it's a long game. You're stuck with these guys forever. But there's also potential that your league folds in 2 years. And then your play on Robert Woods thinking he's going to be good 5 years from now is just useless. Obviously, for Robert Woods, you already know he's good. So you wouldn't really have to be thinking, oh, where's he going to be 5 years from now? But I hope you guys understood what I was talking about when I was rambling there. If you have any questions about that, again, you just leave a comment. I can probably fix what I just said right there to make it a little bit more obvious. So Robert Woods right now, 6 feet tall, 201 pounds, 9-inch and 1/4 hands, which to me doesn't really matter at all, but some people love to talk about the hand size of guys. 29 years old for Mr. Bobby Trees. Last year finished as wide receiver 12 in PPR, 13 half PPR, wide receiver 13 in standard, averaging 15.3 PPR points per game, 12.5 half PPR points per game, and 9.7 standard points per game, meaning on a points per game basis, he was wide receiver 19 in PPR, 19 half PPR, and wide receiver number 19 in standard, which means that, guess what, guys? He was pretty good. Now, again, in every single video, I talk about where they finish on a season at wide receiver, quarterback, running back, tight end. I talk about that because I think it's important to differentiate where they finish at the end of the season versus where their points per game finish is, because a guy can play 16 games, finish as a top 12 wide receiver, but in reality, he wasn't all that consistent on a week-in, week-out basis, wasn't really all that good. He just played 16 games. For Robert Woods, sure, he finished lower on a points per game basis, but he was relatively safe. He wasn't like wide receiver 30 in PPR and points per game finish, compared to like a top 15 guy when it comes to finishing on the season. So Robert Woods to me seems like the easiest trade for target if people are actually off of him, which is what Dynasty ADP is saying. And I don't think he'll be super expensive because, again, he's getting up there in age. Again, guys, this is not the NFL of a while ago. This guy's 29 years old. He's going to be able to play for maybe 5 more years, maybe even longer than that. You honestly never know how long these guys are going to end up playing for, but I think with the situation that Robert Woods is in now, he finished as top 12 PPR wide receiver last year with Jared Goff, and now he has Matt Stafford. So if he played so well last year with a quarterback that most people would say isn't the greatest, and I'm not saying that Jared Goff's a complete and utter fucking garbage can and that he can't do anything at the NFL level, because I think he'll be fine as a Lion, just like he was all right as a Los Angeles Rams quarterback, but he is not Matthew Stafford, and that is kind of obvious to me. Matthew Stafford is actually one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL, and Jared Goff is closer to lower-end, middle-ish kind of quarterback. So I'm thinking with Stafford, his stats should even be able to improve even more based off of last year. He had 130 targets last year, which is about 8.1 per game, ranking 12th at the wide receiver position for 90 receptions, 11th at the wide receiver position for a grand total of only 935 receiving yards, 22nd at wide receiver, and 8 total touchdowns. He wasn't having that many air yards. Jared Goff wasn't really airing the ball out to Mr. Bobby Trees. Only 475 unrealized air yards, 923 total air yards, ranking 45th at the wide receiver position. So when you kind of think about it, when you get a better quarterback in the system in LA, it's kind of a no-brainer that Robert Woods should be much better. If I'm talking about drafting in Dynasty leagues, Robert Woods seems like an extreme value at wide receiver 26, and if people are willing to give him up potentially easily here, this is a no-brainer to go ahead and acquire Robert Woods, because I think as long as Stafford is there, this guy is going to be putting up big numbers for fantasy football. Next up here, we got an old man in Julio Jones, wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons, currently coming off the board as wide receiver number 26 based upon Dynasty ADP. Now, obviously, Robert Woods is 30, which is surprising when you think about it, because Julio Jones, or he's 29, Julio Jones is only 32. It feels like Julio's been playing in the league since I was 4 years old, and he is still going on trucking. Now, I understand that people are like, oh, maybe Julio Jones is going to be done for, right? He only played in 9 games last year, finishing as wide receiver, 52 in PPR, 53.5 PPR, and 52 in standard. But he was averaging 16.2 PPR points per game, 13.4 half PPR points per game, and 10.6 standard points per game. Meaning, on a points per game basis, this guy was wide receiver 14 in PPR, 13.5 PPR, and wide receiver number 12 in standard. So when Julio is healthy, he's a top 15 wide receiver, and you are going to be able to trade a second-round pick likely to acquire him if you're looking to trade a pick, obviously, in rookie drafts. So, why do I like Julio Jones so much? Because people are always going to be worried about the age of Julio Jones. They're going to say he's not going to be able to play for a couple more years. Even if he only plays 2 more years after this, and you sent a second-round pick that could become a easy top 10 wide receiver in fantasy. He could be a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football, and you got him for literally so cheap. This guy ran a 4.39, 95th percentile 40-yard dash, 98th percentile speed score, 93rd percentile burst score, 85th percentile agility score, and 98th percentile catch radius. 6'3", 220. He still has it. Regardless of how old Julio Jones is, if he didn't get hurt last year, you better believe this guy was going to fuck defenses. The defense in Atlanta is not very good, which means they're going to have to be throwing later in games. They don't really have the greatest running back core back there with just Mike Davis, so it seems like Julio Jones is going to be getting in positive game script for the receivers to do very well. In just 9 games last year, Julio had 68 targets, 7.6 per game, one off of being very nice with 69 targets, obviously only getting 68, 51 receptions, 3 total tugs, and 771 receiving yards. In 9 games, he had 771 receiving yards, 39th at wide receiver. This guy is so fucking good. When he's healthy, he will be a top 12 wide receiver, a top 15 wide receiver, and has the potential to be a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football, and people continue to diminish his value in Dynasty leagues because he's so old. Who fucking cares? If you look at him as a 1-year rental, this guy is always going to be in your lineup. As long as he stays healthy, he is going to be dangerous in fantasy football and in real life. If they bring in Kyle Pitts in the NFL draft, should you be worried? No, because that's just another guy you have to cover. Julio is not known as being a touchdown guy. This guy, when he gets into the red zone, when they're in the end zone and they throw the ball to him, this guy turns into fucking Captain Butterfingers and can't catch the ball. But when you throw it to him anywhere else on the field, this guy has glue, Elmer style, directly on his hands, and he catches everything. So don't be worried about the age of Julio Jones. I'm drafting him in redraft, and I'm very confident in him in Dynasty for the 2021 season and to infinity and beyond. Next up, we got my boy Tyler, Boyd, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. Dynasty ADP wide receiver number 30 off the board, 26.4 years old. Now, if you guys have been watching my videos for a while, if you haven't, make sure you hit that subscribe button. No free plugs here, but I can plug myself. But not that way, sexually, just in the regular way. Wink, wink. So, Tyler Boyd is good, but the issue why he's probably going to be able to be acquired for cheaper is because of the draft that happens in a couple of days. They're either going to draft Jamar Chase in the first round, which is going to completely take Tyler Boyd and skull fuck him right in the ass, or there's the other time, right, where the other timeline where they draft Penei Sewell and they draft the wide receiver later. If they draft a wide receiver later, you do not have to worry about Tyler Boyd. I think Tyler Boyd will be a great slot receiver in Cincinnati and still be good. But if they draft Ja'Marr Chase, I will be shitting bricks for Tyler Boyd. But I don't think they will do that. I do not believe they will do that. So I'm comfortable taking my shot and trying to trade for Tyler Boyd. Last year, played in 15 games, finishing as wide receiver 29 in PPR, 35.5 PPR, and wide receiver 37 in standard. Averaging 12.8 PPR points per game, 10.2 half PPR points per game, and 7.6 standard points per game. On a points per game basis, he was wide receiver 37 in PPR, 38.5 PPR, and wide receiver number 43 in standard. But before we get into his overall numbers on the season, I think it's important to differentiate Tyler Boyd with Joe Burrow versus without, because the difference is so fucking huge. In the 10 games he played with Joe Burrow versus 5 without, in half PPR, he's averaging 12.73 points per game with Joey B, 5.04 without, 16.18 PPR points per game, 6.04 without Joe Burrow, 9.28 standard points per game with Joe Burrow versus 4.04 without. Why is this? It's an uptick in targets, 8.7 per game with Joe Burrow, 4.6 without. 6.9 receptions per game. Very nice. I like. With Joe Burrow versus 2 without. 0.3 touchdowns per game versus 0.2 without. That really doesn't matter too much. Touchdown total is very hard to predict in fantasy football. And then 71 receiving yards per game with Joey B versus 26.2 without. So you do the math. You think about it. With Joe Burrow, this guy is dangerous. Without Joe Burrow, this guy was demoted from dangerous to like a fucking squishy toy or something. So you think Joe Burrow is going to be healthy next season, hopefully. They draft Sewell to protect him. Tyler Boyd's going to be great. Now, if you look at his overall season stats, again, they're not the greatest, right? 110 total targets, 22 at wide receiver, 79 receptions, 20th at wide receiver, 4 total touchdowns, 48th at wide receiver for a grand total of 841 receiving yards. But when you think about it, when you give Tyler Boyd, Joe Burrow, the ceiling is super high for him to potentially be a top 10 receiver. Now, again, I'm not saying all these guys will necessarily actually finish as top 10 guys, but realistically, you can see that. And he's a very safe flex or wide receiver 2 week in, week out, especially with Joe Burrow healthy. So I don't really understand why people are not talking about Tyler Boyd as much. I kind of do, because I understand, hey, maybe they end up drafting Ja'Marr Chase, this, that, and the other thing. But I'm not as worried, and I think that Tyler Boyd is definitely a pretty safe target right now at this point, because I think even if they draft Ja'Marr Chase, Boyd will be all right to what you pay for him right now. But I think that if they don't and they end up going for one later in the draft, that Tyler Boyd's value is pretty much identical to without them drafting Ja'Marr Chase. So next wide receiver here, here's where we start getting a little bit spicy and we start taking risks. So if you wanted the safer options right here, the top 3 guys, then you can go ahead and just leave the video now. But we're about to get risque, about to get a little bit spicy here. So let's do it. Henry Ruggs is the next target. Now, I am not even the biggest fan of Henry Ruggs, but I don't see a scenario where it gets worse than what we just saw, and I feel like he just shouldn't be a bust based on what I've seen out of college when he was at Alabama. Obviously, it's possible that he was, but he didn't play in all that many games, and now Nelson Aguilar is gone. Ruggs is currently coming off the board in Dynasty as wide receiver number 47 based on current ADP. I apologize for that. He's 5'11", 188 pounds. Was a first-round pick last year out of Alabama, 22.2 years old. This guy's 40-yard dash is basically lightning fucking McQueen off the line. A 4.27, 100th percentile, 91st percentile speed score, 98th percentile burst score. But last year, this guy went complete and utter limp dick on the Las Vegas Raiders. In 13 games, finished as wide receiver 92 in PPR, 88.5 PPR, and 87 in standard, averaging 6.5 PPR points per game, 5.5 half PPR points per game, and 4.5 standard points per game. Meaning, on a points per game basis, he was wide receiver 98 in PPR, wide receiver 94.5 PPR, and 87 in standard. And frankly, I think a lot of people are just done with Henry Ruggs. Last year, people were on their knees giving this guy a supreme suck like their name was fucking Mia Malkova. And now, everyone is saying deuces like Tyreek Hill to this guy. They don't want anything to do with them. So, when people are zigging, we zag. And we're going to hop on the Henry Ruggs train. Now, again, I am not 100% believing that Henry Ruggs will actually turn it around. But for some reason, there is just something that I feel will change without Nelson Aguilar there. And I feel like Henry Ruggs will have a much better 2021 season. Again, this is more of a hunch. This is not really based off of any stats like the other one was, the other 3 wide receivers. It's more just based off of what my brain thinks and how I feel about how Henry Ruggs was as a prospect versus how he played last year in Vegas. Final guy to talk about in today's video is my boy Gabe Davis, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills. This one is going to be a super long shot, but we've seen a lot of potential out of Gabe Davis, especially last season. 6'2", 216 pounds out of UCF, 22 years young in his rookie season in 2020. So, he played in 16 games, finished as wide receiver 56 in PPR, 54.5 PPR, and wide receiver 47 in standard, averaging 8.6 PPR points per game, 7.5 half PPR points per game, and 6.4 standard points per game, meaning on a points per game basis, he was wide receiver 72 in PPR, 70.5 PPR, and wide receiver 62 in standard. What I want to look at for Davis is not his stats on the whole year, because in my opinion, that's kind of useless. I want to look at how he did at the end of the season versus at the beginning. So at the beginning of the season, weeks 1 through 12, this guy was soft serve ice cream, limp dick, didn't do anything, right? 5.5 half PPR points per game versus the final 6 games of the year that he played, 10.73. At the end of the season, he was averaging 12.07 PPR points per game versus 6.45 to begin the season. 9.4 standard points per game at the beginning of the year, or at the end of the year, versus 4.55 to begin the season. Why is this? It is in an uptick in targets, going from 5.17 per game versus 3.1, 54 receiving yards versus 27.5, as well as 2.67 target or receptions per game versus 1.9, and a strong uptick in touchdowns, 0.67 per game versus 0.3. This is in one of the most high-octane offenses in the NFL, in my opinion, in the Buffalo Bills. I think the Bills are a very good offense. I think they continue to be very good next season. Gabe Davis is the wide receiver 3 on the team. If they look to move on from Cole Beasley, or maybe if he just gets a more solidified role like we saw later on in the season going into the playoffs, we could genuinely see Gabe Davis be very useful in 2021 fantasy football, and I am looking to acquire him on the cheap right now before it's a little too late and we see him ball out just like we did later in last season at the start of next year. So thank you guys all so much for watching. I love you guys all. Have a great rest of your guys' day. Stay safe, and I'll see you beautiful bastards tomorrow with another banger of a video. As always, guys, stay safe. Good boy.